They can be found at every circuit throughout the world. An army of fans grouped around the red flag with, in its centre, a black prancing horse on a yellow background. These are the tifosi, the Italian word for fans, but they are not necessarily always Italian. Yet at every Grand Prix, no matter where, they display the same enthusiasm, the same devotion, the same passion. Just one person in the whole history of the sport is capable of inspiring such enthusiasm. That man, through his team and his cars, has become the symbol and the very embodiment of the sport as a whole, Ferrari. Motorsport's idol has a terrestrial home in Italy, far from the major industrial cities of Italy's northern plains. It is to be found here, in the middle of the rural province of Romagna Emilia, between Bologna and Modena, a little town called Maranello. Since the 50s, this otherwise ordinary town has become the mecca for motor racing enthusiasts everywhere. Because it is here that the sport's very own idol established and then ran his company and went on to forge his legend as one of the country's most famous citizens. This forerunner earned much respect and distinction in a long life that was totally devoted to the passion that is motorsport, a passion which motivated him to his dying day. His personality was as charismatic as it was enigmatic. He had the manners of aristocracy, yet the character of a resourceful worker instinctively secure in his surroundings. The blood and spirit of people from here unite to create an obstinate type of man, capable and enthusiastic, combining the qualities needed to make racing cars. I don't think I would have achieved the same results elsewhere, Ferrari wrote in his memoirs. The history of Enzo Ferrari, then, is one, first of all, of the roots which he established and then returned to, where he initially installed his team and then his own mark. But it was also the history of a revolution after many years spent in Milan working for Alfa Romeo, with whom he learned his trade.
E ricordo che nel 1912 vidi una fotografia sulla stampa illustrata che si pubblicava allora a Torino di Raffaele Di Palma, e mi sembra avesse vinto in quell'epoca la 500 miglia di Indianapolis. Mi dissi: questo è un italiano, perché un giorno non potrei anch'io essere un pilota d'automobili? E tutti gli atti sono stati una conseguenza di questo sogno dell'adolescenza.
Enzo Ferrari was born of a modest family in 1898. He wasn't a brilliant student and from an early age devoted his energies to racing, first becoming a driver in the prestigious Alfa Romeo team in the early 20s. His record as a driver was good, but gradually he realized that he was more talented and capable of motivating people. He found that he enjoyed running a team more than driving for it. Being a driver was not enough for me, he would say. I soon realized that I had an inner desire to do something for the car, a creature that I loved more than anything else. He stopped racing and instead he found his métier in running the Milan team, which he succeeded in moving to workshops in Modena.
Io non ho avuto la possibilità di studiare, mi sono fermato a quella che una volta era la terza tecnica, che oggi equivale alla terza dell'obbligo. Però nella vita mi sono sempre contornato di persone molto colte, capaci e soprattutto pervase dal desiderio di avere successo.
When he was over 50, Ferrari was made an honorary engineer in recognition of his car's victories. But he would repeatedly emphasize that he never considered himself as an engineer. "I'm only the motivator," he would joke, his way of describing his role in his business. So it was that in the late 20s he founded Scuderia Ferrari, whose sole aim was to run the official works Alfa Romeo team. On the flanks of his cars, however, the glorious four-leafed clover would slowly be replaced by the prancing horse, which would become even more famous. It was the symbol of an Italian fighter pilot, whose widow, one victorious day, offered it to Ferrari to make his own. However tough Ferrari's basic character may have been, sentiment was yet another paradox, and he reverently accepted his honour and would faithfully strive to make it more famous throughout his life. During the second half of the 30s, as victories became scarce in the face of the German steamroller, so relationships between Alfa Romeo and Ferrari deteriorated. The latter was forced to return to Milan, where he found himself under the command of a managing director who believed that a racing car should be the product of the rigid planning of all the departments of the factory, whereas Ferrari, who simply believed in his own hands-on management, felt that it should be the work of an independent team, capable of interpreting engineers' ideas in the shortest possible time. This difference of opinion ended with a divorce, which left Ferrari bitter and hungry for revenge. After the war, Alfa returned to competition with their Alfettas, which Ferrari maintained had been designed by his engineers. That was something that was strongly disputed, no doubt without reason, although it seemed to be more the product of Ferrari's frustration than his engineers' labours. Whichever way around it was, the 1.5-litre supercharged Alfettas turned out to be unbeatable, went on to win every race in 1950, and driver Nino Farina became the first ever world champion. Meanwhile, Ferrari decided to establish his own team, but rather than go for the supercharged engine, he opted for a normally aspirated but bigger power unit. Ascari finished 5th in Scuderia Ferrari's first world championship year. The Alfas dominated again in 1951, but the Ferraris were becoming more and more competitive, and Gonzalez took pole position at Silverstone. On July 14th, 1951, Ferrari would finally have the proof that he dreamed of, that the skills he had learnt at Alfa had been worthwhile, for his driver, Froilan Gonzalez, beat Fangio, and the new constructor from Modena won for the first time. While savouring the taste of victory, Ferrari would say, "I cried with joy, but also with sorrow, because I had killed my mother," his way of severing his ties and dependency on Alfa Romeo. From then on, the Ferrari myth gathered strength. It was the start of an unprecedented record in Formula One, and one that would continue, almost unbroken, for 4 decades, until the death of Enzo Ferrari in the summer of 1988. The great champions in the sport would drive for the team, and they would win 9 drivers' titles, 8 constructors' titles, 103 races, and start from 110 pole positions between 1951 and 1990. After Ascari in 52 and 53 and Fangio in 56, it was Hawthorne's turn in 58. But this success was soured by one of a number of tragedies that would haunt Ferrari throughout his life: Peter Collins's fatal accident. The Englishman was like a son to Ferrari after the death of his own son, Dino. Phil Hill in 61 was the first American world champion. Surtees in 64 was the first motorcycle world champion to win the title on 4 wheels as well. But his relationship with the team, which began so well, gradually fell apart over the years, resulting in a stormy parting in the middle of the 67 season. But Ferrari now suffered badly. From 65 to 74, the team didn't win a single title, even though they employed the best drivers, who in turn drove brilliantly. But this era marked the peak of the Ford Cosworth V8's career, and Ferrari succumbed under the number of British teams using the power unit. Any other team would have been devastated by such a continuing lack of success, but Ferrari reacted differently, learning a lesson in defeat. He questioned his own tactics and approach, put them to the test in endurance racing, and then regrouped his forces with a better organised Formula One team. To lead his restructured team, Ferrari once again chose wisely in his selection of Austria's Niki Lauda. Thanks partially to the strength of his character, the mid-70s would be golden years for the Scuderia. In In 3 seasons, the team won 2 drivers' titles and 3 constructors' titles, confirming their undoubted technical superiority, which only ended in '78 when Lotus learnt to harness ground effect. Ferrari learned quickly and followed the aerodynamic trend, so that in '79 the Scuderia was back on top again, winning both world titles. This time it was the turn of South Africa's Jody Scheckter to win the crown, and so great was the team's superiority that only Scheckter's own teammate Gilles Villeneuve represented a real challenge. But the impassioned French-Canadian was totally loyal to his team leader, allowing him to go for the championship, remaining content to help secure it by protecting him from his closest rival's eager efforts. Unfortunately, this loyal team spirit collapsed with the arrival of Pironi, who, after Villeneuve's death, would then lose the '82 championship when it was virtually won with a career-ending accident at Hockenheim. After Lauda 6 years before at the Nürburgring, the German Grand Prix would once again cost the Scuderia and its drivers dearly. Tambay and Arnoux won 4 races and the constructors' title for the Scuderia in '83. And by employing Alboreto the following year, Ferrari seemed to have overcome his disinclination to help an Italian driver win the driver's title. But it was in vain. In '85, McLaren and Prost would once again keep the red cars at bay. Their prestige, however, would remain intact.
Amare l'automobile era la prima qualità, la prima dote che io dovevo scoprire nel mio interlocutore prima di assumerlo. A me era stato un compito quello di agitare dei problemi e di provocare delle riunioni e assistendo ai contrastanti pareri dei miei collaboratori col modesto potere di sintesi di cui ho sempre disposto prendere delle decisioni.
He was a motivator, certainly, but he was also a dictator. Ferrari always refused to share control of his team, which sometimes led to internal ructions. The most famous was that at the end of the 1961 season. Even though the team was dominant, the year ended with the collective dismissal of all the senior staff.
Eravamo 8 direttori. Ferrari, non so per quale ragione, voleva licenziare 3 di queste persone. E sa com'è, si cominciò a discutere, si cominciò a parlare, lui disse che non ci si doveva interessare di queste cose. A un certo momento, lei sa che quando si comincia a litigare con una persona, poi è difficile sapere i limiti. E in questo caso, infatti, lui perseguì lo scopo, volle licenziare queste persone e noi, i 3 tecnici, io, Bizzarrini e Galassi, dovemmo a un certo punto prendere una posizione. Prendemmo la posizione di rigidità, dicendo che se lui licenziava gli altri, anche noi ce ne saremmo andati. E infatti fu così, perché lui non tornò indietro. Oserei dire oggi sembra un'ingenuità, sembra una ragazzata, però è accaduto così.
Having thus proved the strength of his character and will, Ferrari also proved his forward thinking and clairvoyance by replacing Chiti as chief engineer by a young unknown who would quickly make his mark, Mauro Foghieri.
Io ho avuto la fortuna di progettare nella mia vita di tutto, con l'aiuto ovviamente di tanti tecnici alla Ferrari. Non ero solo io, c'era un capo dell'ufficio tecnico che era Rocchi, responsabile principalmente dei motori. Poi avevamo Salvarani che era responsabile dei cambi. Io ho avuto vicino a me i migliori progettisti italiani. Io ho avuto la fortuna di avere come maestro Iano. Iano è stato con me fino al 63, all'inizio del 64, e mi ha insegnato molto.
For a long time, Ferrari was almost the only team to enter both the sports car and Formula One World Championships. One has to remember that the heroic duels between the prancing horse from Maranello and the giant of Ford from Detroit in the Le Mans 24-hour race in the 60s also contributed to and helped establish the Ferrari legend. But the team's participation in that championship also, unfortunately, tended to tax the resources of the Scuderia, and the production of its superb road cars, initiated purely to finance the racing, was not sufficient. By the end of the 60s, however, advertising and sponsorship, banned until then, began to make its appearance in the sport. This could have been the lifeline needed for a team as expensive to run as Ferrari. Not surprisingly, given its immense prestige, the team was in pole position to receive this godsend, which the major tobacco and drinks manufacturers fought for the chance to give them. However, faced with this new phenomenon, which in principle was ideal, Ferrari, rather than grab the helping hand extended to him, instead reacted in completely the opposite way. He resolutely refused to exchange the traditional red livery of his thoroughbreds for the colour scheme, however attractive and recognisable, of a packet of cigarettes. "I don't smoke, and neither do my cars," were his words. His solution to the financial problems was to sell his production car factory against the guarantee that the purchaser would give the racing team, of which he would retain personal control, the budget that it needed to stay on top. The cunning Ferrari initially negotiated with Ford, probably aware that nothing would come of it, but that it would at least prompt Fiat into action to meet his conditions. His tactics worked superbly. Ferrari then, having secured his team's financial future, remained solely in control of its sporting future.
Una repubblica non funziona in una squadra di Formula 1. Non può funzionare. Ci vuole un capo con del carisma, con molta determinazione. È meglio fare delle decisioni sbagliate che non avere decisioni.
Ferrari's relationships with his drivers were often unclear and difficult. Critics would say that the only ones with whom he parted on amicable terms were those who died in his cars. That's obviously an exaggerated opinion, but even so, not without a grain of truth. Ferrari did not get on well with those drivers whose fame overshadowed the glory of his own team. Furthermore, he found it hard to bear the national opinion which held him responsible for the accident which cost the life of the unlucky Lorenzo Bandini in 1967. From then on, he shied away from hiring Italian drivers, which prompted further attacks from his national press, who objected strongly to his attitude. The drivers who did die in Ferraris were certainly some of the best in the world, but even so, the cars gained the reputation of being the best prepared and safest in the sport. And between 1950 and 1990, out of nearly 500 Grand Prix, only 5 drivers died in Formula One Ferraris, which, statistically speaking, is very few. Basically, it's most unjust to make anything of such statistics. Ferrari can only be accused of being autocratic and crafty.
Sure, we had some difficulties working sometimes because he, with his emotional way, made maybe wrong decisions. And me, with my straightforward approach, upset him sometimes. But I think the result really proved that our cooperation was good, because I could have won 3 championships with him in 4 years. Okay, one I didn't win, he says because of Fuji, I say because of the accident.
He could be particularly devilish at times when he was frustrated and when he needed to show that he had ultimate power over all things that involved us. It drove him crazy to have a driver criticize his machine. He could not understand that it was a sport that idolized human beings and admired machines and people that made them. But that wasn't enough for Ferrari. He wanted the whole shot.
Il rapporto macchina e pilota è molto semplice. Io ho sempre pensato che potesse essere fissato in una percentuale media del 50% al merito al pilota, il 50% merito al costruttore, alla macchina. Ora stiamo vivendo un periodo nel quale intravediamo uno spostamento di questa percentuale di merito alla macchina con le nuove costruzioni.
Ferrari would gradually come to accept the talents of foreign engineers. While still being fiercely patriotic, he admitted that the English were dominant when it came to chassis design and construction, while the French aerodynamicists were masters of their trade. In the end, the only thing that mattered to him was racing. Late in life, he upset the whole of Italy by handing over overall technical control to an Englishman, John Barnard, who refused to work at Maranello and instead, not for the first time, insisted that Ferrari should build a separate technical centre for him at great expense in England. Once again, Ferrari shrugged off the critics and granted Barnard his wish, even if he did feel somewhat humbled. But for him and his team, winning was everything.
Le sconfitte per lui erano un'iniezione di vitamina per continuare a combattere. Era molto più giovane di tanti giovani che aveva di fianco. L'unico aspetto che aveva era che si fidava troppo della sua sensibilità e spesso si sbagliava sul conto degli uomini. Gli errori che ha fatto Ferrari sono sempre stati di carattere umano.
Ferrari's only passion was really the automobile. Until his dying day, he thought of little else but the most fascinating variation, the racing car. More than anyone else, he established the breed and embellished it.
La macchina da corsa per me è come un figlio. Quando lei pensa che il figlio rappresenta la continuità di noi stessi, lei lo porta a scuola, il giorno che riesce negli studi che è il primo della classe, lei è orgoglioso del proprio figlio, capita quello che per un costruttore realizza trasformando una materia informe dei forgiati in una meccanica vivente, in una armonia di suoni.
When Enzo Ferrari died one summer's day in 1988, he was already a legend in his own right. His was a life of noise and intensity, of glory and intrigue, of passion and drama, blood red like his cars, and written with the help and endorsement of the greatest champions in competition. Their greatest honour, no matter whatever else they may have done in their lives, was to defend the colours of the Scuderia. Certainly, a man such as Ferrari could never be replaced. He had his successors who did their best to safeguard the unique heritage which he had left to his country and motorsport in order to prolong this living legend. It's a task equal to the ambition of he who wrote, "I bestow a very simple heritage on those who have just discovered me, to keep alive the search for progress which has marked the past, even at the price of sacrificing some of the most noble human lives." To progress and to conquer, that was the creed of Enzo Ferrari. My Bugatti is more beautiful than all works of art, proclaimed the great painter André Derain. One can really understand the enthusiasm and appreciation of the painter when one studies a Grand Prix Bugatti. It isn't perhaps a work of art in the literal sense, because its beauty is more functional and, in a way, coincidental. But it's certainly a masterpiece in its contours as well as its lines, whose balance and purity are faultless. That other great name in motor racing, Enzo Ferrari, wasn't quite the same art connoisseur as Bugatti, who came from a great creative family. However, when he described the creation of a racing car, he used words which were more artists' jargon than engineers.
Che la macchina bisogna prima sognarla, per poi chiedere ai propri collaboratori se si sentono in grado di realizzarla, se condividono il sogno di chi vuole ottenere successo.
A racing car, however, is basically conceived and designed for a reason. It has a job to do, and any technological considerations revolve around that basic raison d'etre. Even so, some, if not all, racing cars generate admiration in what are almost sculptural qualities, which reveal the hand of the artist who created the shape, drew the lines, and embellished the profile. Is there then a mysterious rapport between beauty and practicality in spite of the differences between art and technology? Is it true, as some will suggest, that that which is beautiful is necessarily effective? Or, to put it in racing language, if it looks right, it usually is right? One thing is for sure, and that is that certain designers have more artistic talent than others. They may all be engineers, but not all have an artistic touch which, consciously or not, is revealed in their designs. Furthermore, the spirit of avant-garde unites certain engineers and certain artists in a common quest for innovation, with the same penchant for risk. Gordon Murray, who designed the Brabhams in the 70s and 80s, was never simply happy to design competitive cars. The product of his pen always had an air of elegance, too.
I think generally in engineering, things that look right are right. It's something that happens almost subconsciously when you're drawing something. There are a lot of areas on the car that aren't actually aerodynamically important. And it's just as easy to make something pretty as not pretty, and it's something you have in you, I think. On the car design side, I think there's a very strong emotional feel, even though it's a very technical subject, a racing car. When you're designing a car, I certainly have a very strong emotional feel for it. And I think anything that's technically as perfect as a Formula One car is an art form anyway.
There is a style to creativity, but then there is also a style to driving itself. Quite simply, but also significantly, driving may be divided into two areas. There are the fighters or attackers, and the stylists. But first of all, can we assume, without abusing the term itself, that there is an art to driving?
I think any activity in the highest plane of ability develops into an art. To have the balance, the poise, the concentration, it takes an artistic touch to take out the most of any racing car, to be able to use a track more completely than anyone else, to recognize the limits of the car and manage them to the limits, the ultimate limits of the driver's skill. To be able to combine all of those things together is indeed a very special skill, which I believe is art form.
there again exists the coincidence between the beauty of the action itself and its efficiency. The art of driving has evolved with technology over the years. In these heroic early days, margins for maneuver were limited by the poor handling of the machines themselves. It was more a question of courage, of physical force, of tactics, and of mechanical sympathy. But once the chassis began to develop, along with suspension and tyres, a new style of driving was born, that of sliding the car, the controlled drift. This was deliberately induced to take advantage of the balance and maneuverability of the machine by surpassing the physical limit of adherence thanks to driving ability. Tazio Nuvolari was the inventor of this style of driving in the 30s. Later, Juan Manuel Fangio and Stirling Moss would take this style of driving to its limit. But Moss, in turn, invented his own technique. He discovered that there were new limits to braking, thanks to the progress made in road holding in the 50s and 60s.
The art of driving a car is to keep a car balanced. And you ask more of a car than one normally would, and you put it into a position where you're saying, I want you to steer, and taking the feedback from the car gives you a message. And I felt that obviously accelerating and braking, there isn't that much difference to one driver to another. There's some, but not that much. And I felt that if I could run my braking into a corner where my braking would then accelerate or compensate for steering. In other words, you go into a corner, if you brake at the right place, you can oversteer. You can then use that set oversteer, if you like, to accentuate the steering that the car will give you, and therefore utilize it for the cornering of the car.
Moss honed his style of driving by watching his sometime team leader and rival, Juan Manuel Fangio, who reckoned that science had nothing to do with it, and whether artist or driver, natural talent was everything.
Bueno, el estilo se va cumpliendo con el tiempo. Nadie nació sabiendo. Y al principio, cuando yo corría, todo lo agarraba fuerte. Hasta me lastimaba las manos. Después comprendí que no era necesario. Con los dedos se manejaba mejor y que todo se va haciendo con el tiempo. Nadie nació sabiendo. Todo lo aprendemos con el tiempo.
At the start of the 60s, the movement of engines in Formula One from the front to the mid-engined position in the chassis and the decrease in their power due to a reduction in capacity gave rise to a style of driving that was altogether more subtle. The very sensitive behavior of these passive machines, which seemed so ready to spin like a top at the slightest sudden change of balance, demanded an increasingly greater sense of precision and a touch more delicate than ever. Furthermore, the development of suspension, which could be adjusted to each individual circuit, demanded an increasingly greater relationship between a driver, his engineers, and his car. Jim Clark was the first expert of this trend, which continued and was established by Jackie Stewart and then Niki Lauda during the 70s. These champions established the theory of total temperance in their driving, to the point where they managed totally to disguise any sensation of speed to observers. In fact, to watch those who practiced in this school of driving with their squeaky clean cornering lines and faultless acceleration, one was tempted to think, wrongly of course, that they were totally in control all the time. Equally, it seemed that their speed was in directly inverse proportion to the effort that they made to set quick times. Others, however, stayed faithful to a style of driving altogether more instinctive, generous, and spectacular. The Ronnie Petersons and Gilles Villeneuves of this world had just one passion, one creed, one approach: to attack to the limit. They fought as much with their cars as with the opposition, and they gave their all with great panache, even though it may not have been the ideal way of extracting the best from a Formula One car of the 70s or 80s. In fact, the advent of softer and softer tyres meant that their style of sideways driving tended to overheat their tyres. which was harmful to both their survival and efficiency. But it also caught the imagination of the crowds, who recognized how these crazy warriors generously let their spirit run amok. Their audacity, their extravagant style perpetuated the myth of the romantic daredevil heroes, elevating Grand Prix racing to the world of Beethoven. A Grand Prix start, the raucous din of unleashed engines which cause the earth, air and eardrums to vibrate in unison, is also the opening of an heroic overture. The field which jockeys fortissimo on the first lap, the sharp, abrupt gear changes, the mounting revs after each one, which mix together in a syncopated and frenetic rhythm. They sound like something produced by an orchestra gone mad. The irresistible flight of a Clark or a Senna equates to the lone escape of a soloist who copes with his task with the skill of a magician. A refueling stop perfected during the 80s at the height of the turbo engine's thirst is a ballet of rigorous precision, managed to perfection by the crew chief, who is briefly the director of choreography as he balances the awful potential danger of fuel escaping onto overheated mechanical parts and the need to waste the least time in order to send the impatient driver back into the race. The race's rhythm is a tune's tempo. It's imperative to avoid false notes, to run off the laps with the regularity of a metronome. Yes, great drivers are both sportsmen and artists. They demonstrate their art in their driving style, each in his own register. Fangio is the Grand Master, the Beethoven of the circuits. Clark was grace personified, the Mozart of Formula One. Stewart, all finesse, was a sort of Debussy of the wheel. Lauda drove as Bach composed, with an unfailing discipline. Prost, always precise, is the Vivaldi of the tracks. Senna, the introverted genius, he is the Schumann of Grand Prix racing. And one can come up with many more comparisons, without forgetting Strauss and his waltzes, of course. The score of a Grand Prix is sometimes perilous for the players, and those who conduct appreciate that.
Ricordo che von Karajan un giorno mi disse e mi scrisse, ascoltando il vostro 12 cilindri, scaturisce un'armonia che nessun maestro saprà mai interpretare.
But art in Formula One is also a fascination with machines. And Jean Tinguely uses them as a basis for his art. They are part of his life's work, and he admires them so much that he shares his room with Jim Clark's Lotus.
Nous en sommes, avec la Formule 1, arrivés à un point où l'être humain crée un objet, crée un mythe, crée une chose fantastique qui est pour moi œuvre d'art parce qu'elle a cette qualité de me surprendre, de me bouleverser, de me faire vivre, de me faire respirer avec mon étonnement brûlant en voyant cette incroyable aventure de l'homme avec la machine.
With a bit of mockery, Tinguely's creaking creations attempt to track the secret of movement. Emanuele Zerini, on the other hand, tries to convey speed in bronze. He was originally a photographer, but wanted to express the abstract of the speed of racing cars in model form, as seen through his own particular lenses.
En fait, quand je crée une sculpture, pour évoquer une idée, j'essaye de la dépouiller le plus possible de certaines de ses formes, comme les ailerons, les porte-à-faux aérodynamiques, toutes ces choses-là, tous ces appendices qui font qu'en fait, quand on détaille, c'est pas joli, quoi. J'essaye de rendre les choses le plus fluide possible, et comme c'est quand même un objet qui est par définition statique, si je commence à l'alourdir d'artifices, ça sera au détriment du dynamisme dans la lecture de l'objet.
Michel Leconte is among the many artists worldwide who like to bring their subject matter to a standstill in order to work their own magic on it and make it move again, faster than ever.
j'étais jeune peintre, je faisais une traduction qui était plutôt non figurative. Et plus je me suis intéressé à cet univers, plus j'ai travaillé et j'ai approché les hommes, plus je suis devenu réaliste.
Photography was virtually conceived with the automobile. And since the first masterpieces of Jacques-Henri Latigue, the kindly forerunner in this genre, it has perhaps been this medium that has best expressed the magic of speed and transformed our perception of space and time, representing the most amazing phenomenon of the century. Latigue's successors worldwide are well known. Assay, Snowden, Schlegelmilch or Rondeau, whose pictures capture and retain the spirit of racing in an imaginative kaleidoscope of lines and colours. Children, of course, are the first to be fascinated by the world of Formula One, which is conveyed to them by the medium of the strip cartoon. The adventures of Michel Vaillant are seen through the eyes of Jean Graton, who manages to embellish fact with fiction, making attractive and intriguing stories. Formula One has even been touched by the legendary Beatles. George Harrison composed and sang a moving tribute to Ronnie Peterson after the fatal accident which claimed the life of the great Swedish driver. Even so, there was a typical touch of British humour of the video that went with it. Why, it's Jackie Stewart chauffeuring the roles. Artists, whether wielding bow, paintbrush or steering wheel, either interpreting or participating, are all made of the same stuff. They share the same desires, take the same risks, and draw from the same sources. They seek determination to push them on an unending road to perfection, an inspiration which satisfies their taste for excess, carrying them beyond the known limits of lesser mortals.